More than 30 people died today trying to make the migrant voyage from France to England, the biggest single loss of life of this kind ever recorded. Tonight, in a special edition of Newsnight, we're live in Dover, looking at this crisis in the context of so many trying to make the same voyage. What should be our own country's approach to those desperate to come to the UK? And how do we combat an illegal trade risking the lives of so many? Good evening. It is tragedy on a horrific scale. At least 31 people confirmed dead in freezing waters as they tried to find an escape route from their old lives. These migrant voyages are often framed as a political crisis, but they are first and foremost a human one. Whatever your politics, it is hard to see the death of families, children in the sea, off our coasts as anything other than failure. Tonight, as the Prime Minister chaired a meeting of COBRA, we speak live to a Home Office Minister and ask the French side for their response. We question what the scale of the small boat crossings tells us about migration in the UK today, and we ask how close we are to finding the solutions that can stop this kind of danger becoming routine. Lewis Goodall has spent 2 days looking at the crossing points between France and England and is here now. Just talk us through what we know, first of all, of those lives lost at sea. Well,
Emily, as you say, over 30 people dead, several others battling for their lives tonight in a Calais hospital. And I have to say, I was out on the English Channel in a fishing boat about 5 a.m. this morning. It was so dark, it was so cold, and you couldn't help just but wonder who was out there, how many boats were out there. And we had a bit of an insight into that because we were listening to the radio, the Coast Guard radio on the French and the British side, and the radio was crackling the entire time. Constant activity. We need to send a boat here. A fishing trawler has seen a boat there. Constantly, you could feel it. And we knew that this would happen because speaking to people in the camps yesterday, there was an awareness, very plugged into these things, that the weather was going to turn over the next 48 hours. And last night and the morning could have been one of the last best chances to make that crossing that so many of them are desperate to do. And so many now have tragically lost their lives as a result. Obviously, a great deal of political reaction coming in both from the British and the French side. Here's what the Prime Minister had to say tonight.
I'm shocked and appalled and deeply saddened by the loss of life at sea in the Channel. I think that the details are still coming in, but more than 20 people have lost their lives, as you know. And my thoughts and sympathies are, first of all, with the victims and their families. Our offer is to increase our support, but also to work together with our partners.
And of course, now talking to the Prime Minister, they're talking about working with our partners and cooperation with the French. Now, of course, it's no secret that relations between the British government and the French government have been strained, partly over this issue, partly over many issues, but there have been a great number of calls for perhaps joint patrols and greater cooperation. Clearly, that is going to intensify in the coming days. Here's what the French Interior Minister had to say earlier today as well.
The response should also come from Great Britain. Just 3 days ago, I had exchange with Priti Patel, the British Interior Minister, in addition to our sometimes lively discussions on the resources that Britain gives to France, but which remain minimal compared to the resources that we put in place, of course. Mobilising more police officers, more cameras, more resources in general. Calais and the Île-de-France region, northern France, has been suffering for more than 20 years, as you have said. Our two great countries should work together as friends to fight against these smugglers.
Now, the French are saying tonight this is a moment of national mourning, and there has been a great deal of shock and surprise uttered by politicians on both sides of the Channel. But frankly, this was entirely predictable and predicted. I spoke to someone from an aid agency last week who said that if there wasn't a change in policy, then the Channel risked becoming a graveyard. And indeed, that has come to pass over the last 24 hours. And a lot of politicians, the Home Secretary, for example, have been talking about clamping down on the criminal gangs. Now, no one would disagree with that. They are a menace. They are indifferent to human life. They're looking to make money. But on the other hand, the question is that the only part of the puzzle? Because the Home Secretary, again, has talked about the idea of reducing the pull factors that bring people to the UK. But of course, talking to the people in the camps, as I've done, as you say, over the last 48 hours, Emily, many of them talk about just how terrible, how persecuted their lives were back in their countries of origin, wherever it is. Now, if you assume, inevitably, that at least a proportion of the people there will be genuine refugees and asylum seekers, by definition, the life that they are fleeing, the push factor, will not be as will be worse than the pull factor, the thing that is bringing them to Britain. And that is the quandary that politicians in Britain and in France are going to have to grapple with over the coming days and weeks. And in a crisis, an international refugee crisis of some 80 million, is it that surprising that we have a relatively few number of people trying to come to British shores? And I have to say, on the basis of the conversation that I had with people over the last 48 hours in those camps, I fear that few will be deterred, even after the events of the last 24 hours. Here is a sense, as I say, with producer Caitlin Hanrahan and cameraman Jamie Bowles. This is our report and a sense of what life is like in those camps.
Today, over 30 people lost their lives in the cold of the English Channel. We understand that at least 25 boats, if you can call them boats, tried to cross today to beat the worst of the forecast weather to come. Their berths, like this one we saw just this morning, abandoned on the sea, would have been crowded. They would have been small. When some left, it would have been pitch black. It is the worst day for loss of life in the Channel on record. How did it come to this? That so many could be lost to the waves, not on some distant frontier, but on our own. And while the politicians will blame, have already blamed the smugglers, the uncomfortable question lingering in the air on these straits is just how much culpability Britain and France, two of the wealthiest countries in the world, should shoulder. When you think of Dunkirk, this almost certainly isn't the escape you think of. But in 2021, this is what Dunkirk is. Thousands of people from around the world, men, women, children too, living in the woods, wandering the motorway, waiting for the call to flee at dawn and cross the sea from France to Britain. We've spent the last few days here talking to those in this political purgatory. First thing, the French police mounted a morning raid.
So people are literally just wandering up and down this street because their camp has just been broken up. The French police have destroyed their things, their sleeping bags, their equipment and so on. And now they've just got to wander up and down until they can find somewhere else to go. Have you tried to cross the UK already?
Of course.
How? In a boat?
By boat. 2-3 times, but we not lucky. That's why.
And what happened? You got turned back?
Turned back, sometimes my boat is, how do you say, broke down or nowhere. Sometimes they, by police, they take us rest like that.
Even police, French police, taking all our items belongs to us. They have destroyed all our tents, sleeping base, and foods, water. From our perspectives, from your viewpoints, France is a safe country, but actually it's not.
Though most wouldn't speak on camera, this was a refrain we heard again and again. When we asked why people weren't claiming asylum in France, some said family in Britain, historic ties between their countries and Britain, language, but many cited how they had been treated by the French government and their belief that Britain would be more humane. The overwhelming feeling here is of futility. The endless cycle. The police take away their things, aid groups like mobile refugee support give them back, and on it goes.
We have families here with children less than a year old. We have families with pregnant women. We have toddlers, as well as groups of young teenage boys, people who have been forced from their country.
Charlie, who has worked here for 6 years, say these camp dispersals happen as often as twice a week.
If the police were here, maybe they would say, well, look, when organisations like yours are undermining what we're trying to do, because we're trying to deter gangs and from bringing people here and trying to deter people from trying to settle here, and then you're undermining that. What would you say to that?
They could suggest that. However, we know that that's not true because we are a humanitarian aid organisation. We are not interested in how or why people are crossing to the UK. We are, and that is not what's important. That is not what's shocking. What's shocking is the way that people are being treated here on a daily basis. What's shocking are the amount of human rights that are being abused on a daily basis, and the fact that all of this is being funded by the UK government.
We should remember too that in terms of numbers at least, compared to other European countries, or indeed elsewhere, we're not talking about that many people. It's just more visible.
I think it's different in terms of illegal immigration. I think if you look at the overall numbers of people coming in illegally, they're broadly the same as they were in my time. But what's changed is the method When I was in the job, a lot of the illegal migration was coming through the port of Calais, and people were penetrating the port perimeter, climbing into the backs of lorries and getting through that way. But we have invested quite a lot of time and effort with the French on tightening up the port of Calais. It's much harder to break into the port now, and we have some quite sophisticated search capabilities to detect people climbing into lorries. When you add that to the COVID crisis, where less lorries are coming across anyway, the human smugglers have changed the tactics, and they've now taken to this relatively new phenomenon of putting people in small boats and bringing them across in that way.
And there's that familiar futility again. Later in the day, the camp simply reforms up the road, and as night falls, they know they must wait by the phone lest the call comes to head to the beaches. For all we know, any one of these people could have been one of those who perished in the sea. Conditions on land are only a bit better than the boats.
This is my dance.
So you're sharing this with your mate, your friend?
Yes. Now we are three.
3 people
Yes.
in this little tent?
Yes. It's real tough.
There's much discussion in Britain about whether these people are genuine asylum seekers. It's a fair question, but also fair to consider whether many or most would credibly take these sort of risk if they weren't. This man, we're not naming, is only 20 years old and says he wants to get to Britain because it's where his last family connections in the world remain. And where did you come from?
I'm come from Iran, Kurdistan, Iran.
Kurdistan, Iran?
Yes.
And why did you leave? What was the reason?
The politician, you know, is the government of Iran, you know, killed Kurdish people, hang them, kill them. They put us on a jail with no reason, you know.
What did they do? What did they say to you?
They said me, you must leave this country or we will kill you. That's all. And my dad is now in the jail, you know. It's been 1 month, I don't know what happened to him.
Must be really scary.
Yes, yes, of course.
Imagine if you got to the UK, what would you like your future to be like? What would you like your
life? Like, yes, like other people, living like our life. No, yeah, that's real tough, yes. Get a job, get married, get children.
We talk a lot about the different humanitarian situations in different parts of the world. At least some of those humanitarian situations will have prompted at least some of the people to be here today. And yet we have our own humanitarian situation, if not crisis, on our own border, just a few miles from England. Here people don't really have anywhere to sleep, they don't have anywhere to go to the toilet. If it wasn't for the aid agencies and companies that come along here, probably wouldn't have anything to eat. And all of that is happening in the full knowledge of both the British and French governments. On that theme, the Home Secretary tonight spoke of reducing the so-called pull factors which bring people to Britain, which make them take the risk. Critics, though, will say that that simply does not reckon with the fact that what pushes them from wherever they came will always be worse, that some will always come, and unless we recognise that fact, what happened today could easily happen again.
Lewis Goodall reporting there from Calais. Well, Nick Watt, our political editor, has been keeping an eye on things in Westminster, where that Cobra briefing, Nick, has been going on. Probably just broken up now, has it? Nick, what have you heard?
Well, in the last hour or so, Emily, we've heard that there's been a joint phone call between Boris Johnson and the French President Emmanuel Macron. And there are some quite interesting indicators of the sense of direction in the number 10 readout of that call. So it talks about how there's an urgency of stepping up joint efforts with France, talking about the importance of keeping all options on the table, and Emmanuel Macron has been talking about the importance of working jointly. Now, I understand that the strong thinking, the strong wish in number 10 behind me is they would like to see joint UK and French patrols along the French northern coast. So that would mean British security forces and French security forces. And the reason for that is it is so very difficult to police that entire coastline. So many, obviously, crossings managed to get through. And the reason why that is so significant is that there is a feeling that if you could intercept as many as 75% or even 90% of the boats crossing, that would have a huge impact. It would basically destroy the economic model of the smugglers, and then it would break up their network. But I have to say that this has been a huge issue in Downing Street. I was talking to one senior official. They say that over the last 18 months, they have attended more meetings on this in number 10 than any other issue, with the exception of COVID.
And more widely, Nick, what are those dilemmas then for government?
Well, dilemmas are challenging, and in Westminster, quite an emotional afternoon. I broke the news of this terrible tragedy to one of the ministers who's involved in this. It had sort of just happened. This minister had been in a meeting, and they were just completely shocked. They sort of held their hand to their face and went, "Oh my God, that is horrific." So an emotional, a human reaction. But there are Conservative MPs saying that the political problem for Priti Patel is that she has, in the last few years, made very strong claims about how she's going to deal with this issue, but actually she has very few powers. There are no international waters in the English Channel. It's UK waters or it's French waters. We can't go into French waters, and in UK waters there's strong international maritime law. So there's talk about turning around the boats. Well, that can only be done if the boats are completely safe. These boats are never safe. But Priti Patel is saying that she does have a plan. There's new legislation going through Parliament at the moment. She says that's really going to toughen up the appeal system. You won't be able to have appeal after appeal after appeal. In the first case, when you make your asylum claim, you'll have to lay everything out that is why you should have be given asylum. You can't sort of further down the line say, oh, there's this about me that means that I'm in danger. And the other thing that Priti Patel is talking about is distinguishing between illegal and legal routes to the UK. And what she's saying is if you come on a legal route to claim asylum, then you'll have a much better chance of having a successful application and a much easier passage to settling in the UK. I have to say that distinction between illegal and legal routes is obviously strongly challenged. So a feeling today that we're waking up to what is a monumental challenge.
Nick, thanks very much indeed. We'll be speaking to the French side in just a moment. But right now, joining us from Westminster, the Minister for Immigration Compliance, Tom Pursgrove. And Minister, this is a human tragedy on an indecent scale, but you'd accept, I'm guessing, that this also speaks to massive political failure.
Well, I have to say, Emily, that this has been a thoroughly depressing day. And I think all of our thoughts are with those who've lost their lives, their families, their loved ones. This is undoubtedly a huge tragedy, and it was a day that I always feared. The simple truth is that people should not be putting their lives in the hands of evil people smugglers to come to the United Kingdom, leaving what are safe countries in order to get here. I think that is a fundamental principle. It's one that successive governments have upheld, and it still applies today, and it's fundamental to the policy that we are pursuing. But of course, I think the clear message that comes out of today is that we must redouble our efforts, working collaboratively to address this issue and make this route unviable.
Right, let me just talk through some of those policies then, because Priti Patel has suggested in the past offering border guards this chance to push back, to turn back migrant boats. Have they used those powers, and are you still comfortable with border guards using those powers after you've seen what's happened today?
Well, ministers have obviously signed off those operating procedures, and we believe that they are safe and legal. But it is obviously for operational commanders
at sea
to make a decision. Well, of course, this was an incident that occurred in French waters that did not have an interception involving UK vessels. I think it's very, very important to make that distinction. But these are very, very dangerous crossings that people are making. I think it is right that the United Kingdom has a maritime deterrent. We have a maritime border. It's important that we have a maritime deterrent. But of course,
that's not a maritime deterrent.
Those measures
that's asking border guards to take people's lives in their hands, isn't it?
It is, of course, absolutely right that maritime commanders at sea who are professionally trained and have a lot of experience make appropriate operational decisions, and that's precisely what they would do in the event of these tactics being deployed.
Have you asked to send maritime officers, border guards, to France. Would you like to see that northern shore patrolled by your own people?
I think what is really clear is that, of course, we've had this collaboration in place for some time now, but we need to go further. We need to deepen that collaboration and that cooperation. And, of course, the Prime Minister and President Macron have had exactly that discussion this evening. That is something that I am very keen to see happen. It is the case that in the past we have offered to host and to help with joint patrols. I think that that could be invaluable in helping to address this issue, and I really do hope that the French will reconsider that offer. And it's right that the dialogue continues in the days ahead to make sure that we get this response right, and we do everything we can, working collaboratively to address these concerns that people rightly have got.
The blunt truth is that there has been no collaboration, that we don't have any kind of bilateral returns deal with France or any other EU country. Our return deals are with Albania and Pakistan and India. Frankly, the French don't trust us, we don't trust them, and we failed to work out any route.
Well, I'm afraid I don't accept that, Emily. Day in, day out, there are operations going on both sides of the Channel with strong collaboration with our border force and operational staff working with the French side to make sure that actually there are many crossings, many crossings, hundreds of crossings on most days stopped from happening. That is important collaboration. We want to stop these crossings from happening in the first place.
How many bilateral deals have you got on returns, Minister?
On the specific issue of returns, which is an entirely separate matter but important nonetheless, we do not have, with the European Union, a returns agreement in place at the moment. That was something that we did offer as part of our withdrawal negotiations. The European Union decided not to proceed with that. I think that that was the wrong decision. I think it was very disappointing. And of course, we do need to have a returns agreement in place with either the European Union or with individual European countries. We are continuing to work towards that objective. We think it's crucial as part of the wider package of measures to address this issue of these dangerous crossings. And I do think that the political climate that we're seeing in Europe at the moment, you look at these issues on the Polish border, for example, means there is becoming a greater focus on these migration challenges. I would argue that the way we best address this is work together and deliver a returns agreement that shuts this route down and finally makes it unviable.
Absolutely. And these crossings are an absolute crisis that can end, as we've seen today, in tragedy. But when you look at the real numbers, we take far fewer asylum seekers than many of our European counterparts, Spain, Germany, France and Greece. If you hadn't shut down those legal routes, if you hadn't stopped, for example, the Dub scheme for child asylum seekers, if you hadn't taken away the safer routes, these wouldn't be happening.
Well, I'm afraid I would dispute that. And of course, safe and legal routes is right at the heart of our policy. And you look at the fact that over the summer, we evacuated 15,000 people out of Afghanistan. We've got the Hong Kong BNO route in place at the moment. And the Syria scheme is now completed, where we took 20,000 people and resettled them in this country. And of course, there are many people who've also availed themselves of the family reunion route that is in place in this country, and that we're very proud. This country rightly has a proud tradition of helping those who are finding themselves in desperately difficult circumstances. And a lot of the work we've done on this has been in joint collaboration with the UNHCR, where we've taken the most vulnerable people from the region and provided sanctuary, and that is the right approach.
Right, because you'll know then the UNHCR are highly critical of the Nationality and Borders Bill, which they say shatters our adherence to the 1951 Refugee Convention that we not only signed but part-authored. That this is the point at which we are pulling out from all those responsibilities from the Refugee Convention that's been 70 years old.
Well, I'm afraid I would respectfully disagree with the UNHCR on that. We are very confident that the measures that we are introducing through the bill are fully compliant with our international obligations, and safe and legal routes are front and centre of the policy that we are pursuing. But fundamentally, for the reasons that you've alluded to in opening this programme tonight, we have to shut this route down. We have to make it unviable. Nobody should be getting in a small boat to try to come to the United Kingdom. They are leaving France, which is a safe country. Of course, we need to collaborate. We need to work with our European neighbours on this, but we also need to work upstream as well and make sure that people are properly supported in region, and that they're not just trying to cross the Channel, that they're also not trying to cross the Aegean either. There are some huge challenges here that we've got to work internationally as well as domestically to tackle. That's precisely what we're doing.
Tom Perscliffe. Thank you very much. Thanks for joining us here on Newsnight tonight. And we're going to head straight to France. We're joined by a member of the National Assembly for President Macron's En Marche party, Mireille Clapeau, who is also a member of her Parliament's Foreign Affairs Committee. And our colleagues this evening have shown at Channel 4 filmed French police literally standing by whilst boats of migrants set off. Perhaps you can explain why the French authorities are being so reckless about these people.
Hello. First of all, I would like to express my strong emotion. 31 people were dead today, and it's really a tragedy. I think the only solution we can find is together. We need to increase cooperation because due certainly to the Touquet Agreement of 2003, the control of the border is no longer in UK, it's in Calais or in Dunkirk, so it's in France. And this has to be a shared burden. It cannot be only the burden of France.
But why are police standing by, doing nothing, watching these boats full of children setting off? Why aren't they stopping them?
Well, I don't think it's the real situation because certainly...
We've seen the pictures.
France has some limited means and resources, and I think that France does its best, but it's really facing a challenge. It was said before that it's not exactly by the number of crossing, it's because the smugglers are becoming more and more powerful and want to make more and more money. And so they convince these poor people that it's time to cross the channel, even when it is very cold, very dark. So
exactly. Our reporter just yesterday, Lewis Goodall, filmed the moment that migrants were raided by French police, coming in, taking their sleeping bags away. What purpose is that meant to serve? Is that meant to get them off French shores or just make their lives even more awful?
I think what you are describing is maybe something different. We were very shocked, and the Calais inhabitants were very shocked because there was a great jungle, you know, a big camp where people wanted to stay because their obsession is to cross the channel and to join either their family or a new life or a country where they speak the same language, which is the English language. And we tried several solutions, and dismantle the campaign certainly is not the best solution. And I'm part of the left wing of En Marche, and we propose some things that are different, but we cannot keep these people here. We try to propose them, the state try to propose some other houses, some other places to live in France, but they have one obsession again, is to cross the channel and they came back.
So talking about solutions then, Mireille, would you welcome help from the British in terms of border guards, officers, maritime officers, policing on your shores if it meant that it was trying to solve this crisis?
As President Macron said, it's not only a French UK problem, it's a European Union British problem. And there is a Frontex, you know, Frontex is a group of coast guards that are very skilled, trained, that have the proper equipment. And certainly Frontex is more dedicated to this type of tasks, which are very difficult.
Okay, I'm hearing a no in that answer. Let me ask you, because the Minister just told me that it was France who chose to refuse a returns bilateral agreement. Is that right? Why is that so hard now?
Sorry, could you repeat your question? Maybe you have some information that I don't have.
The Minister just told us on Newsnight that it was France's choice after Brexit to choose not to have a bilateral returns agreement. Is that correct?
Well, I don't know exactly. I can tell you that Brexit was the British choice, and that now there is a strong border between the United Kingdom and the European Union, and we have to find a new solution. Certainly, the two-gate agreement are not convenient anymore, and this has to be solved at the European level.
Mireille Clapeau, thank you. Thank you for joining us here on Newsnight this evening. Well, the frequency of small boat crossings has risen significantly in the last year, but the actual numbers are telling a very different story on asylum. Fewer people have come by land or air because of the pandemic, and total asylum claims actually fell by 4% in the year to June 2021. Nevertheless, Britain will remain an attractive proposition to all those fleeing their own countries, hoping for a better life here. And the answer, as today reminds us, cannot be found at the hands of reckless people traffickers with inflatable dinghies. With the options for safer legal routes very limited, what is our long-term solution to this problem, and can we solve it without the help from our closest neighbours? Here's David Grossman.
Out of the Channel, another boatload of migrants arrives in Dover Harbour. We saw a few women and children, clearly exhausted and freezing cold. Most, though, were young men, some barefoot. It was a scene repeated throughout the day.
Those nearest three dinghies are ones that have arrived today, and we are told there are several more out at sea on their way in. The only thing as regular as these arrivals, it seems, is the proclamations of the politicians telling us they're about to get a grip of this. So what are the potential policy solutions?
Peter Walsh researches UK migration policy at Oxford University. He says there's not much the government can do without help from other countries.
It's reasonable that people would expect the government to be able to do something about this, but in certain respects its hands are tied. It's compelled under the Refugee Convention to hear asylum claims from people. It's compelled under international law to rescue people in distress at sea. Some people, although they would like us simply to be able to apprehend these boats and dump the migrants back off in France, the only issue there is that that would entail invasion of France. So there are all these kinds of legal, practical constraints that do indeed make it a very difficult challenge to be met.
In Dover, the migrants begin their journey through the system in this marquee. One solution the government keeps suggesting is offshore processing. That's the way Australia ended migrant boat arrivals, by taking them to third countries. And if found to have a genuine asylum claim, that is where they were resettled. None made it to Australia itself.
It was about breaking the business model of the people smugglers. Really cruel, greedy, evil people.
Alexander Downer is the former Australian Foreign Minister who helped develop the plan.
We dealt with it in two ways. First of all, we established offshore processing, in our case in Nauru and Papua New Guinea. And secondly, we, on a very few occasions, turned back the boats as well. So the message was clear, not just to the people smugglers, but to people who might use people smugglers, that it was impossible to get to Australia through that method.
But would that work in the narrow, busy English Channel, where there's little international water and so not much space to turn boats around?
The turning boats back policy is an extremely dangerous policy and not one that I can see is going to be practical in the long term. It strikes me that it's potentially in breach of maritime law, and if I was a captain of a ship or a border force official trying to attempt this sort of manoeuvre, I'd be very worried that if a boat capsized and someone drowned, I'd be potentially gripping the brass rail in the dock.
And the cost of the other half of the Australian plan, offshore processing, is potentially huge. That is, assuming the UK can find a third country to cooperate.
All of these solutions take a lot of money, and it would take a lot of money to pay the receiving government, to build the infrastructure, to staff it. But it's certainly not a quick fix. It's not an easy fix, and it's not cheap.
Rather than trying to stop the boats, some argue we should simply open up new, safe and legal routes to claiming asylum in the UK that don't involve taking to the water. But that, say others, is fraught with difficulty.
That is a solution that the government does not support. If we look around the world, there are very few countries that do, and that's because they expect quite reasonably that that would lead to a substantial increase in asylum applications.
So what's left? Well, according to some of those we've spoken to, if the UK wants to reduce the numbers coming, it may need to make itself less attractive.
If we could complete the entire process, asylum application, decision, necessary appeal processes, if we could get that down to 8 to 12 months, that would make the UK far less attractive than it is now. Right now, you can confidently expect to spend 8 to 10 years making your way through the system. And then even when you finish the system, you're still not going to be arrested and removed in anything like a quick space of time.
Not only is the asylum system not deterring economic migrants, say critics, the general absence of bureaucratic checks compared to other affluent countries makes the UK particularly attractive.
We don't have the infrastructure to know exactly who's in the country and where they are in the same way that many European countries have. We don't have the same bureaucracy around labour laws that we do in France, for example, and so there is a draw in that respect. We need to try and address the reasons why people are drawn to come to the UK in this way and to risk their lives in doing so.
The dinghies are towed away, the pile of life jackets is removed. Tomorrow, how many more people will make the short but potentially lethal journey from France? Right now, there appears little the government can do to stop them.
David Grossman there will join us here in Dover, excuse me, as the Chief Executive of the Refugee Council, Enver Solomon, and Kevin Saunders, who was the UK Border Force's Chief Immigration Officer for 15 years. Welcome to you both. And Enver, if I can just ask you about the point that David was making, reducing the pull factor, for example, cutting down that amount of time that you spend on the process. So it's 8 to 12 months as opposed to a decade.
That's right. I mean, Germany does it in 6 months on average. There's more than 30,000 people in the system who've been waiting over a year. The system is not efficient and effective, and we need a system that works well and that makes good quality decisions quickly. I would support a system that doesn't leave people languishing in limbo, facing a hostile environment when they have to live on £5 a day, when they're not even allowed to work, where they're sent to accommodation without Wi-Fi, when their mobile phone is taken away from them when they arrive in the UK. That's not a system that treats people fairly or humanely.
Can I take you one step further? Would you support an offshore system where that whole process happened outside of the UK?
Absolutely not. It's cruel, it lacks compassion, it lacks humanity. There's no need to do it, and it won't act as a deterrent, and it's really unworkable. It won't act as a deterrent because people are coming here, as has been highlighted in your various reports tonight, and as Lewis said at the top of the programme, because of very powerful push factors. We know, and our own research that we published last week shows this, that of the 5 top nations that are coming across the Channel, the 5 top nationalities, 7 out of 10 of those people will be recognised as refugees. That tells us that they're genuinely fleeing persecution.
Kevin, you were doing this for 15 years. I mean, when you hear a statement like that these people are fleeing war, do you sometimes think, actually, what you're doing is futile because you're never going to put people off wanting to come to a country if the alternative is persecution?
My job was to follow government policy, which is what we actually did. I disagree with Enver. I think going offshore is the only answer. We have got to make the UK less attractive, and that is the only way to do it.
And when you hear that it would make us into a country that almost had given up on people, given up on any kind of humane asylum system, does that worry you?
No, it doesn't, because I don't think that's right. We've got to, if we want to stop asylum in the UK, we've got to make the UK less attractive, and that is the best way of doing it.
And I guess that goes to the heart of it, that this government was voted in on a very memorable promise, slogan, that they were going to take back control, that everyone knew it was about immigration, everyone knew it was about borders, and they've been quite frank about it. They don't want to see as much migration.
I recognise that this is a challenge for a government that was elected on a manifesto pledge to take back control. But I also recognise that Prime Ministers since Winston Churchill, including Conservative Prime Ministers, many Conservative Prime Ministers, have always upheld the principle that sits behind the UN Convention that we helped draft, that people should get a fair hearing on UK soil. And indeed, there's many parliamentarians who have refugee heritage in their background, and that proud tradition needs to be maintained today. And it's a tradition which does not differentiate between how you get to the UK. And that is critical. So we just have to abide by that, continue to be proud of that, and recognise that we continue to give people a fair hearing on UK soil.
Kevin would say that there are ways that he just doesn't want this to be one. Kevin, I'm asking you.
Oh, sorry. Well, first of all, the 51 Convention is well out of date. It was written at a different time before we had this sort of mass migration.
So it's the numbers. It's basically the numbers.
It is the numbers, yeah. The numbers have changed. Where they're coming from has changed. 51 Convention was looking at an entirely different situation. It needs to be rewritten. We can't return people that we should be returning because the EU won't let us, because we've left. But even before Brexit, we were having huge trouble returning asylum seekers because the Europeans wouldn't accept them.
So maybe that is the direction of travel. I mean, if Kevin speaks for more people in this country now, and certainly for where government policy is, maybe we're not going to be as signed up to that 1951 agreement as we've long thought we were.
Well, look, we have a Prime Minister who is proud about recognising the importance of global Britain and the role that global Britain should play in the world. We just hosted an international climate change conference. This is a challenge which is about the world coming together, nations coming together in the same way that they've done to address climate change, to look at what we do to address the push factors that force people to flee, the persecution, and recognise that nations need to come together and show their common humanity and respond to people who are desperately in need of safety too.
Emma Solomon and Kevin Saunders, thank you both very much for coming out with us this evening. That is all from us here in Dover. The papers, as you can imagine, are all leading on that same story tomorrow. Kirsty will be back from London tomorrow night, but from all of us here, thank you for watching. Good night.